Good evening. Can you guys hear me? Okay, good. All right, hopefully you guys can grab some beautiful refreshments in the back. But on behalf of the Meneilly Visiting Scholars Committee, I want to welcome you and our esteemed visiting scholar, Dr. Liz Bucar, over here. You guys are in for a real treat, and I am not the official intro for her, so there's more to come about her incredible, what she plans to share tonight. But I want to first just thank you guys for being here, and a few logistics for the evening. We have restrooms out those two doors and these two doors. We have note cards, as is customary. We'll have Q&A. If you fill out a card and you have a question, just raise the card. We've got runners who will take those questions and cards to Gus, and we will have a great Q&A discussion at the end. And we hope you come back tomorrow morning. We will have a complimentary breakfast at 8:30. Our first session will be at 9 o'clock, followed by a 10:30 session. And you really are in for a great treat. And I just want to say these programs and events that we hold would not be possible without your generous donations. And so we made a decision a number of years ago to make this a free program. But if you're in a position to make a contribution, there's a basket on the food table. And then you can always go online, villagepres.org. So I think I now would like to invite Chad to come forward to introduce Dr. Liz Bucar. They have a special relationship. Not really. They have a history.
That sounds worse. Or is it better? Who knows? I don't. Hey, good evening, everyone. Hi, good evening. Let's try that again. Good evening, everyone. Hey, that's better. So it really is my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker for the 2025 Meneilly Visiting Scholars Program, Dr. Liz Bucar. She's an ethicist, an author, and a thought leader whose work challenges us to think critically about the intersection of religion, culture, and ethics in this ever fascinating modern world of ours. Dr. Bucar is professor of religion and the director of the Sacred Rites program at Northeastern University, that's in Boston. She specializes there in ethics and cultural appropriation and gender in religious traditions. Her research spans multiple religious identities and contexts with a keen focus on how practices and symbols are borrowed, adapted, and often misused in today's ever-complex society. She is the author of several acclaimed books, including Pious Fashion, How Muslim Women Dress, and also Stealing My Religion, Not Just Any Cultural Appropriation. In Stealing My Religion, Dr. Bucar examines the ethical complexities of religious borrowing, right? Whether it's yoga in the fitness industry, hijabs worn in solidarity, or worship music that you'll hear in unexpected spaces. This work challenges all of us to consider the power dynamics that are at play when traditions, icons, symbols are borrowed outside their original communities, and encourages us to turn a critical eye to such appropriation. And beyond academia, Dr. Bucar is a public intellectual. Do you consider yourself that? I think you are a public intellectual, bringing scholarly insights into mainstream conversations about faith, identity, and social justice. Her work has been featured in major media outlets. She has a vibrant social media presence. In this way, she brings discussions about religion to all. On a more personal note, it is so good to see you again, Liz. My goodness. Once upon a time, not very long ago, right? That was a couple decades ago. Not very long ago. We were both doctoral students together at the University of Chicago Divinity School. We both studied under Dr. William Schweiker, and we worked together in study groups for our qualifying exams. What that means in real terms is that we ate a lot of bagels, and we drank a lot of coffee, and we cried a lot together. I would not have passed those qualifying exams, Liz, if it weren't for you. And believe it or not, I went and looked. I still have the notes that you wrote for our discussion on H. Richard Niebuhr and Karl Barth. So if you want those back, let me know. I can get those back to you. What I came to so very appreciate about her was the generous spirit that she brings to her work, this commitment to the highest standards of academic inquiry while really just wanting to make it accessible. She is a gifted teacher. She loves inviting people to engage, to test our assumptions and our biases, and through these things to go deeper. It's always about going deeper. She loved seeing the connections between traditions and practices. She loved helping us appreciate how these connections carry meaning beyond our own particular worldviews as we interact in a religiously diverse world. And I could see then what a wonderful thinker and teacher that she was for me, and the work that you're obviously doing since then is so powerful to so many people. It's vital, in fact, that as we seek to understand those things that we value, the food that we eat, the exercise we enjoy, the most important things in our lives, that all of it is rooted in something deeper, these layers of meaning that if we look at it, if we go deeper into it, can help us better appreciate not only our own religion, but other people's religion too. So enough of me. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Liz Bucar.
That was lovely. Thank you. Okay, good evening. All right, everyone can hear me. So I really want to thank this congregation. Where is Roger? Oh, thank you for the invitation for this, lecture series. Thank you for everyone. I mean, there's been so many people who've brought me here. Special shout out to Mary and Desiree, who just really done so many. There's Mary, and they both are to get me here. I want to just jump into it because I have so many things to talk to you about, and I want to hear what you have to say too. Right? This always has a spicy Q&A. So here's the overall theme of what I want to talk about with you as I'm here this weekend. Also, I want to just say, sidebar, I've never had my face on a banner quite so large ever before. I'm very excited about that banner. Mary and I got a picture coming in. So here's the theme of my overall theme of my 3 lectures this weekend. I want to consider how popular spiritual techniques often entail problematic forms of something I'm calling religious appropriation, and how that harms us all. So let me start with a little background. On one hand, Americans seem to be becoming less religious. People who say that they're unreligious affiliated, right, those nuns or those spiritual not religious, by most accounts are about 30% of the US population. It's much higher in my student body. I would say it's closer to 50, if not higher. And some projections say that that'll make up more than half of America by 2070. And yet, accompanying this so-called decline in religious identity is a rise in what is often called spirituality. Crystals and smudging kits for your home, meditation apps and mindfulness programs in school, Burning Man and Soul Cycle. I'll tell you what those are afterwards, and if you want to, Q&A. These are all examples of spiritual practices we engage in for wellness. The non-religiously affiliated do them. The folks who identify as spiritual but not religious really do them. But so do mainstream religious believers, like those of you in this room. But calling these things spiritual doesn't mean they aren't religious, and my talk tonight is about why that matters. So it isn't that I think Americans have given up on religion. It's just more that instead of ordering off the menu, right? Instead of becoming a Presbyterian or a Reformed Jew or a Zen Buddhist, religion's become a salad bar, with each of us filling our plates with our favorites or the options we have been told are healthy for us. I've tried meditation apps and mala beads. I've attended sound baths and even an ayahuasca ceremony. Like most of you, when I need healing, or certainly like most of my students, right? I teach 18 to 21-year-olds. When they want healing, when they want to feel better, they want to reduce stress, they're willing to try almost anything. And there are a lot of companies and wellness influencers willing to tell me and you that spiritual practices are what's going to work for us. But in the race to build the perfect wellness routine, we focused almost exclusively on, does this work? Is it supposed to work? Ignoring almost entirely, why is it supposed to work? So put differently, we want all the benefits of spiritual practices without having to engage with religious communities and traditions that they come from. But that disconnection is not as easy or as clean as we've been told. So tonight I'm going to introduce this idea, this concept of religious appropriation to help us understand some of the ethical implications of shopping for our spirituality in religious traditions of others, And then tomorrow I'm going to basically look at two different case studies, right? One is wellness yoga, and the other is pilgrimage on the Camino. So again, this topic usually has a spicy conversation afterwards. So I'm just going to jump right into it and get to some images for you. So let's start with two photographs. The image on your right is from the 1985 comedy drama called Desperately Seeking Susan, starring Rosanna Arquette and Madonna. And Arquette plays a bored Jersey housewife who tries to add some excitement and passion into her life by dressing and acting the part of Madonna's character, who's a cool New York City girl, but she's also Madonna, so she's like really cool. And I'm basically showing this image to remind those of you in this room. Actually, for my students, I have to like tell them the first place what Madonna is, but I'm trying to remind those of you in this room, right, what she looked like in the 80s. This is her signature style on the right. Now, the little girl on the left is not me, but only because I couldn't find a picture from 1984. Because everything except for that exposed midriff, it could be me. Because when I was 11 years old, like 1984, Madonna became my style icon. I tied mesh headbands in my permed hair. I layered black rubber bands up to my elbows. I wore white fingerless gloves, all accessorized with a gold cross necklace and cross earrings. That was the first time I stole my religion, but it wouldn't be the last. And as a religious ethicist, I think it's a problem. So tonight I want to talk about something called religious appropriation, a messy form of cultural appropriation that my field of study, religious ethics, can help us describe and explain and maybe even avoid. Now, I want to start by saying I know that even suggesting that there is something out there in the cases or something out there called religious appropriation is a little controversial. Moral outrage over cultural appropriation is increasingly common, but cases of religious borrowing are usually accepted, maybe promoted. Many people think we're entitled to adopt the religious practices of others as part of our quest for self-actualization, self-optimization. Religious actors who raise concerns over religious appropriation are often labeled as fundamentalist or reactionary. In fact, the same people who are quick to call it cases of cultural borrowing as exploiting marginalized communities often refuse to recognize that religious communities can also be exploited by others, especially when the others are adopting their practices in the name of politics, education, or well-being. So let me just be direct. My goal tonight is to convince you to stop seeing all forms of religious borrowing as morally benign. I'll argue that some forms, including some very popular forms, are harmful because they depend on and contribute to oppression and marginalization of religious communities and individuals. I also think they're bad for us, the ones doing it, but I'll get to that tomorrow. But I'm also not here to scold anyone. I myself am a repeat offender. In fact, my book, Stealing My Religion, tells the stories of those missteps. But I think we can all do better, and I think that's what tonight's conversation is about. And in truth, we rarely have conversations about appropriation. The term is an expression of moral outrage. It's an accusation of being unwoke. Once it's deployed, all conversation stops. This is what happens in my class all the time. Each party digs their heel in, right? In fact, that's what inspired my book, that dynamic in my classroom. I saw that once the word appropriation was introduced into a conversation, students either retreated or felt emboldened to express indignation, self-righteousness, whatever. And everyone was convinced only they held the moral high ground, and things could get pretty heated. So I want to try something different. What if we try something different? Instead of using the word appropriation as merely a diagnosis, that's appropriation, that's okay, that's not okay, let's use it as an ethical framework. As a starting point, we're reflecting on the ethical implications of religious borrowings, our religious borrowings, others' religious borrowings. When appropriation is merely used to express moral condemnation, it prevents further ethical inquiry. So instead, let's use it merely to signal that we should take seriously the ethical issues at hand. Things that make religious appropriation a particularly messy form of cultural appropriation, such as who engages in it, why it matters, and specifically how it causes harm and what is the nature of that harm. So that's what we're going to take up those issues in order. Okay, to begin, we need to acknowledge religious borrowing and combining has always existed, right? That's nothing new. It occurs when religious communities interact, as it should. Religious traditions spread into new areas, new technologies, possibilities, encourage religious beliefs and practices to shift. And certainly borrowing and combining is how some religious traditions are formed in the first place. Religious communities have doctrinal reasons for actively trying to convert people to their beliefs, right? So evangelical Christians, for instance, believe that they have, that was an interesting Freudian slip. Evangelical Christians, for instance, believe that they have a duty to spread the good news to those outside their community based on their interpretation of Matthew 28:19. This makes them seem like they might be more welcoming to religious borrowing, right? But nevertheless, there's something very different about seeking potential converts who will accept doctrines, leadership models, systems of values, institutions, versus a self-proclaimed outsider who appropriates a religious practice. The latter might be willing to criticize the very idea of organized religion, for example, if they identify as spiritual, not religious, or even to belittle deeply held religious beliefs, all while trying on the religious practices for personal, pedagogical, political, therapeutic reasons. Before I can really get into who engages in religious appropriation, I need to distinguish between religious borrowing and religious appropriation a little bit more, right? This is a better distinction, I think, borrowing versus appropriation, than the more common coupling of appreciation and appropriation. Like, what am I appreciating? What am I appropriating? Because appreciation versus appropriation confuses the ethical issue at hand. Intention is not what's determining factor when something is harmful or not, right? You can intend to appreciate. Positionality of the borrower and the power dynamics are. So I think appropriation versus borrowing is a better way. So here's how I define that term in my book, Stealing My Religion. That black is a little hard to read. I'm sorry, I'll read it for you. So when individuals adopt practices without committing to religious doctrines, ethical values, systems of authority, or institutions in ways that exacerbate existing injustice. So religious appropriation is a type of religious borrowing. In other words, religious appropriation entails insisting, like basically there's two things going on here, right? Insisting that the borrower remains a religious outsider, even while they engage in inside religious practices, and occurs in ways that reinforce existing forms of asymmetrical power dynamics. So I'm sort of saying you need to have two conditions. It's a two-part definition. Let's start with the first section that's in here in black, so it's hard to see. Okay, so let's go back to my Madonna phase and how it inspired me to wear cross jewelry, right? So Madonna, actually, I was baptized Catholic, although I was raised in a congregational church in New Hampshire. But in 1984, at the height of Madonna's popularity, I had started to refuse to go to Sunday school. And yet that's when I started to wear a cross daily. Yeah, you see something? Yeah. I didn't wear the cross as a Christian. I wore it as a tween following a pop culture trend. I wore it because it was cool. In fact, I only wore it because I was confident others would see it as a reference to Madonna, the pop star, and not as my membership in a religious community. I wore it to rebel against my religious upbringing. So part of what makes something religious appropriation is that the outsider position of the borrower. So I would, from that case, I would qualify. I was like, I am wearing this as a non-Christian. But here's another problem. How describe who counts as an insider versus who counts as an outsider? We just don't like this idea in religious studies at all, actually. We hate this. So religious communities have very porous borders, of course, and as a result, the insider-outsider status is always very ambiguous. This is part of what makes religious appropriation particularly difficult, a particularly hard type of cultural appropriation to identify and classify and assess. The insider-outsider distinction is not necessarily as confusing in non-religious forms of appropriation. For instance, for my students, for example, when they think about white people appropriating practices associated with Black communities, in those cases, the debate isn't like who counts as Black and who counts as white, but rather on whether the borrowing is causing harm or offense, right? The insider-outsider dynamic is sort of just kind of given in that racial context. But in religious appropriation, the first challenge is figuring out who owns religious practice in the first place, who is the insider. So one option would be you could have just very clear, fixed criteria about who properly counts as a good Christian or a real Hindu and who doesn't. But that's going to reinforce all kinds of stereotypes and generalizations about religious communities and leave out members that don't fit the dominant mold. So we're not doing that. We need a way to determine insider status without slipping into religious essentialism, which would itself be harmful. So here's the solution I came up with for my book. Instead of worrying about who counts as an insider-outsider, I focus in the book, and we're going to focus this weekend, on people who are self-reporting as outsider status. Like I am an outsider doing this borrowing, who appropriates in part because they believe they can do so safely by remaining immune from religious entanglement. Again, back to my cross, my Madonna. My wearing the cross jewelry coincides with my rejection of Christian identity. Being confident I was an outsider was part of why I adopted the Christian practice in the first place. This means when we notice someone insisting that they're not part of a religious community, but also practices things like they're happily borrowing from that religious community, basically. Both those things are happening at the same time. We have a case of something that might look like religious appropriation. That's only kind of the first step, right? So, as I define it here, anybody can engage in it. I did it as a lapsed Christian, as a teenager. In that case, I was appropriating what was actually my own religion, right? My own tradition. But certainly it's easiest to identify religious appropriation among Americans who identify as spiritual but not religious, because that's kind of like the whole point, right? Anyone who calls themselves spiritual but not religious is in danger of engaging in religious appropriation, since they insist they are religious outsiders, that's their part of their identity, but are also adopting practices of religious communities and traditions, rebranded now as spiritual practices to make them seem more universal and acceptable. And tomorrow I'm going to look more closely, I said, 2 examples, yoga and pilgrimage, and the idea of like who counts as an insider and outsider is more complicated in those two. But for now, let's just keep it simple and say one key to identifying who is engaged in religious appropriation is to find individuals who are working hard to remain religious outsiders by rejecting religious doctrines, religious norms, religious communities, religious institutions, religious metaphysics. They don't dispute religious boundaries. In fact, the distinction between insiders and outsiders is fundamental to their comfort with their ad hoc borrowing. Oh, you know what? I made it. I'm going to go back to this one. So look at the white at the bottom, because it's easy to read. But not all forms of religious borrowing by outsiders are appropriation. Or put differently, not all forms of religious borrowing cause harm. So in addition to the position of the borrower vis-a-vis the religious community and the tradition in question, we also need to have some grasp of the power dynamics the borrowing occurs within. And that's the second part of the definition I offered. There has to be some making justice of the world worse, exasperates existing injustice. So the act of religious borrowing does not cause harm just because it transgresses a religious boundary. It causes harm because of the way it interacts with existing oppression of specific groups in ways that further contribute to their oppression. That's sort of like why the term cultural appropriation is coined in the first place. Put differently, borrowing becomes appropriation when someone in power borrows from someone who's marginalized. And we're going to have to figure out what those things mean, but that's sort of the basic idea. I found actually the American political theorist Iris Young, who was at Chicago when Chad and I were there teaching, still in political science and gender studies. I think her concept of structural injustice is really helpful here for thinking about how power dynamics make some instances of borrowing forms of appropriation. So Young developed a term to refer to a condition that, quote, puts large categories of persons under systemic threat of domination and deprivation. In the case of religious appropriation, existing systemic conditions such as Orientalism, capitalism, maybe white supremacy, are what make religious appropriation a form of exploitation or moral harm. And these forms of structural injustice can adversely affect any religious community, not just the ones that are obviously marginalized. But a couple of things to consider when thinking about the role of power in religious appropriation. For one, it's easier to identify harm when a religious community being borrowed from is a religious minority, since this community is already subject to discrimination. This is a visual example I like to show. So this is a Gucci turban that walked the runway in Milan in 2018. Chad is laughing. It was sold in US Nordstrom stores for $750. Marketed as, quote, ready to turn the heads while keeping you in comfort. You know what that looks like. To the Sikh community, however, Gucci's headpiece clearly referenced a Sikh turban. It was tied exactly the same in a particular angular head shape. Now, according to the Sikh coalition, wearing a turban, quote, asserts a public commitment to maintain the values and ethics of the tradition, including service, compassion, and honesty. But as a sign of Sikh identity, turbans have made Sikhs a target of violence in the United States. This includes hate crimes and even state-sanctioned forms of discrimination, such as the forcible removal of turbans by U.S. border agents. In 2022, there was a big case about that. And the forcible removal of turbans by the NYPD, the New York Police Department, which was part of a class action suit that I served as an expert witness on, that the judge awarded $17 million to the class action for that. Now, to me, the Gucci turban is a clear case of religious appropriation because of the power dynamics at play, right? Gucci, a global fashion dynasty, everyone knows Gucci, using a form of religious headwear to make a profit, while members of a religious minority are targets for violence for wearing the same item. But although religious minorities are often the victims of religious appropriation, this doesn't mean some religions are fair game. For example, we can't say my Madonna-inspired cross jewelry wasn't ethically fraught just because I borrowed from a more dominant religion. So let me give you an example where the assumption that some religions are exempt from religious appropriation comes up. At least this comes up in my classroom a lot. So over the last several years, there's been a growing attention on the role of cultural appropriation in Halloween costumes, Halloween traditions. And yet costumes based on religious clothing, such as the sexy nun, seem to get a pass. Very popular on college campuses still. My students often argue that the nun costumes aren't cases of appropriation because they borrow from the Catholic Church, which is one of the most powerful institutions in the world. But the real impact of the nun costumes isn't on the Catholic hierarchy, or isn't only on the Catholic hierarchy. It's on women religious. It's on actual nuns, right? Who already face mental and physical abuse within the Catholic Church, or are marginalized within the Catholic Church. Right? To assess the ethics of a sexy nun costume, we need to first understand how a habit functions in the religious life for these women. Wearing religious clothing can communicate religious identity and community belonging. This is especially true for consecrated individuals like nuns who devote themselves to religious service and wear specific clothing as part of their religious calling. A habit is also closely connected to the values of religious orders. Habits, for instance, are purposefully modest. Keeping parts of a woman's identity private, parts of her body private, preventing her from being sexualized by others. In contrast, these are actually names: bad habit costume, sinful sister costume, and twisted sister costumes flip a habit's original purpose on its head in an attempt to make the wearer seem more attractive. Now, to be sure, Halloween is now a secular holiday which has connections to All Saints' Day, which is originally celebrated saints, but dressing up as your favorite saint for Halloween is strikingly different from dressing as a caricature of a nun in a, I would say, violent, provocative, and mocking way. Now, as Sister Allison, who is a sister of the Daughters of St. Paul, explained to me, she and her fellow sisters wear these distinct outfits so people can recognize them and feel safe in approaching them with their their outfits, when approaching them with their spiritual needs, right? This means, she told me, that nun costumes, these costumes, can be confusing and weaken the impact that we want our habits to have in the world. Another nun from the Daughters of St. Paul told me, quote, "The more people let this image of religious sisters affect the way they think about real religious sisters, the less we are able to act as sisters to everyone." For these nuns, Halloween sexy nun costumes can limit their ability to carry out their mission in the world. Now, maybe you still think, my students actually still think, that nun costumes are justified as a critique of Catholic systems of oppression, such as patriarchy, homophobia, transphobia. They see this as kind of like the Madonna sort of Catholic rebellious thing. But have you ever seen a sexy monk costume? Probably not, or not as often, right? It's significant that a sexy nun costume are more popular than sexy monk ones. They leverage stereotypes of women's bodies as sexually dangerous and thus contribute to gendered sexism. They don't combat it. Okay, so certainly religious minorities are more likely to experience harm from religious appropriation, and certainly practices associated with Eastern religions and indigenous religions are more likely to be appropriated by sort of mainstream American culture. But the issue of power in cases of religious appropriation is much too complicated to allow us to categorize some religions as immune from exploitation just because they're associated with powerful institutions or leaders. So even Catholicism, arguably the most powerful religion in the world or institution in the world, does have special status at the UN, so okay. Even Catholicism can have its religious practices appropriated. And I think the sexy nun costume is an example. The second issue that's important for understanding the role of injustice in religious appropriation is how racial inequity contributes to it. For instance, I think my students are more sensitive to cultural appropriation, and I have a very progressive student body, because they assume that only the first, cultural appropriation, only cultural appropriation, is involved in white supremacy. That means they're missing the extent to which religious appropriation can also sometimes depend on whiteness. The ideology of whiteness is manifested in various ways in religious appropriation. For instance, when practices that are associated with like brown bodies are adopted by white people, so think about Gucci's turban. Or histories of racism are erased, that's going to come up in my case study tomorrow on the Camino. Or when forms of appropriation position white Americans as the proper interpreters of the true means of a practice, and that's going to come up in the yoga conversation tomorrow. So the racial power dynamics involved in religious appropriation go way beyond the simple white-black binary. Although a whole lot of white people are doing religious appropriation is not something that only white people do. So let me give you an example. This is Cardi B, in case you don't know who she is. She's a very, very, very famous singer and pop star, okay? I love how I translate different things for this audience and my students. I'm like, so Madonna was a really important pop star. This is Cardi B. You've probably heard her name. Now I'll explain to you what she said. This to promote her upcoming shoe collection for Reebok. Grammy winner, so she's a big deal, right? Cardi B was featured on the November 2020 Footwear News cover, styled as Durga, the many-armed Hindu goddess. Wearing a candy apple strapless gown against a hot pink background, Cardi B held a shiny red shoe from her collection in 2 arms. Another 8 arms fanned out and over her head, showing off her signature 3-inch coffin nails and her upper arm tattoos. And the text reads, "The power of Cardi B," a clear reference to Durga's reputation as a fierce warrior goddess. So Chad mentioned on social media. I used to be a lot on, at this time, like in 2020, I was very much on Twitter, which is called something else now. I noticed right away on Twitter that Desi Twitter, that South Asian Twitter, was expressing a lot of moral outrage about this. So at my Desi girl tweeted, "Cardi B appropriating Hinduism and you all call it fashion, that's disrespectful." Someone else wrote, "Cardi B using Durga Ma to sell trainers? Question mark, question mark. When are you people going to realize our gods and goddesses aren't there to be mimicked?" Another example, "Cardi B using my religion as a way to promote something, trying to cover it up as homage is disgusting." That user also pointed out the shoe made the image particularly offensive, given that shoes are considered ritually impure and removed before approaching any Hindu idol and entering a Hindu temple. But not everyone agreed this was a problem. In fact, for many, the fact that Cardi B was a black woman meant the power differential present when white women appropriate from black women were missing, and so they assumed that it wasn't a case of appropriation. And again, I agree that there's something particularly egregious and quite actually common when white people appropriate practices associated with non-white communities. That dynamic is actually the focus of Studying My Religion. But a racial black-white binary is not the only way whiteness is involved in creating exploitative conditions for appropriation. What? Let me say that again. You don't need a racial white-black binary to have whiteness involved. So let me explain. This is actually what critical race theory is about. Here you're going to get a little primer. It encourages us to think about race beyond just the binary and see how assumptions about race are at the core of how many dominant groups assert their superiority of others. And that several disfavored groups in this country have been racialized at particular times in history. Jews have been racialized. Muslims, Sikhs, Hindus, they're all examples of racialized religious communities. But let me return back to Cardi B. This popular singer might be black, but she's also a Western woman appropriating an Eastern image to promote her celebrity brand. She personally experiences anti-black racism in the US, but also she personally benefits from Orientalism and capitalism, which are also expressions of white supremacy. Cardi B's race doesn't mean her Durga cosplay is morally neutral, because even as a black woman, she lives in a context where the relationship between race and power goes beyond that black-white binary. And actually, before moving on, let me just say that Cardi B is actually a class act and apologized for this image afterwards. And one thing she wrote in her Instagram post was, "I can't change the past, but I'm going to do more research in the future." So that's just like a a plug for coming to more lectures, I guess. But that is actually very uncommon that someone will walk back and apologize. I think that the Cardi B example shows how religion complicates our understanding of who can be, the agent, the bad guy, the villain in case of religious appropriation, right? Usually in discussions of cultural appropriation, racial identity in issues of cultural appropriation is how we determine who the insiders and outsiders are. But in the context of barring religion, it becomes clear the role of whiteness is much more complex. And it'll come up a little bit in the talks tomorrow too. Okay, so let me recap. Okay, so far we've discussed who engages in religious appropriation, basically anyone who insists they're an outsider, and why it's harmful, like why there's harm caused because of these existing forms of structural injustice. But now I want to spend some time explaining why I think the stakes of religious appropriation are so high based on what I see the nature of that harm to be. So economic exploitation is the most common way of describing the harm caused by cultural appropriation, particularly when the products and labor of one group are monetized by another group in ways that depend on and reinforce asymmetrical power dynamics. The exploitation of religious appropriation can be economic. Madonna commodified Catholic aesthetics to promote her brand. But it can also be much more. It can also unsettle how religious practitioners see themselves, the world, the very meaning of life to them. This is because religious appropriation is not just any cultural appropriation. That's the subtitle of my book. Because religion is just not any form of cultural practice. It's culture deeply tied to what theologian Paul Tillich called the ultimate concern, an ultimate concern. At stake in religion is an entire understanding of reality, the meaning of life, even our very soul. So when religion is appropriated, the results can be particularly unsettling. Here's someone else I found helpful. American philosopher Joel Feinberg. I had to search for a long time to figure out how I was going to talk about harm. I found it in legal scholarship. He has this concept that I think is super helpful, and it's a term he calls profound offense. So first, Feinberg distinguishes a harm from an offense, and then a minor offense from a more profound one. So he defines harm as a setback to someone's interests, while an offense does more insofar as it affects one's state of mind, making one feel maybe disgusted or outraged or appalled. Feinberg further distinguishes between a minor offense and a profound offense. A minor offense is an affront to one's senses, like literal senses, or their lower sensibilities. It's a nuisance. A profound offense, in contrast, is more egregious. It is, in Feinberg's words, quote, deep, profound, shattering. Actions that are profoundly offensive do more than put one in an unpleasant state of mind. They're an affront to one's core values, sense of self. As Feinberg puts it, they offend us and not merely our senses and lower sensibilities. And Feinberg uses the example of voyeurism and mistreatment of a corpse as examples of things that are profoundly offensive. I think when outsiders insist they have a right to adopt the religious practices of others, they assert entitlement and disrespect communities and traditions of thought and practice. But in addition, from the religious insider's point of view, some forms of appropriation can be experienced as an affront to one's core values, sense of self, orientation in the world. That can be traumatizing. They can be, in other words, profoundly offensive. Let's go back to that sexy nun costume for a moment. Remember that a nun from the Daughters of St. Paul said, the more people let this image of religious sisters affect the way they think about real religious sisters, the less we're able to act as sisters to everyone. She experiences these costumes, in other words, as an obstacle to her fulfilling her vocational calling. And this exploitation of nuns is not just confined to Halloween costumes. In fact, there's a term, nunsploitation, is used to describe an entire genre of exploitative film that was popularized in the 1970s, in which the celibate, cloistered nature of nuns becomes the basis of storylines about sexual deviancy and demonic possession. In these films, nuns are used for the voyeuristic exploration of sexual and religious dysfunction and violence. And I would consider this genre a form of profound offense to nuns, because it's an affront to their values, but again, also their sense of self. Okay, so far we talked about what's religious appropriation, who does it, why it matters. It only seems fair that I spend a little bit of time giving you some ideas of thinking about how we might do better. So you might think I'm going to tell you you should avoid adopting the religious practices of others. But avoiding religious borrowing, first of all, it's impossible, especially given the way religion is consumed in our contemporary American context. It might also be undesirable because it could prevent further forms of meaningful engagement, right? I don't want us all siloed. So the question becomes, how do we borrow without appropriating? And my answer might surprise you. I don't think the solution is borrowing less religion, but borrowing more. So let me explain. Engaging the religion of others is not the problem. The exploitation of religious appropriation lies in the assumption that we can consume religious practice without embracing religion, per se, that we can remain an outsider, but also that we're entitled to do so. And I want to pause here a moment and acknowledge that I'm speaking to you here in this, beautiful church, so I'm assuming that many of you identify as Christian and not the sort of spiritual, not religious person who loves to pick from the salad bar religion, looking for a technique to try on without rules or doctrines. But are you sure you're not borrowing practices from other traditions, maybe Eastern, maybe indigenous, maybe a little yoga, maybe a little mindfulness practice? So one way to prevent that sort of religious borrowing becoming appropriation is to reconnect the practices to religious communities and traditions that claim them. Part of that's education. I'm an educator. I think more education for everybody, right? Because once the borrower understands the religious meaning of the practice and its associated metaphysics and systems of values, it's more difficult to consume the practice as a mere therapeutic technique, right? A mere pedagogical commodity. So remember Cardi B's realization that basically I should have just done my research and I wouldn't have posed with this shoe. And actually you'll see in the case I talk about tomorrow, the more I learned, the more I had to shift what I was doing because it no longer lined up, I realized, with my core values. I shifted the way I was engaging these practices. And yet, religious literacy is not enough. I think equally important is giving up this hierarchical framing of us versus them, which is just so American right now, that animates the appropriation in the first place. This can only occur if we're willing to abandon the idea that we have a right to universalize and domesticate the religious practices of others. So for the non-religious affiliated who think that organized religion is problematic, religious practices are techniques for self-improvement and happiness. For folks who have their own sincerely held religious beliefs, though, the religion of others sometimes is treated as a repository of cultural artifacts to be tried on for personal goals, while simultaneously rejecting the religious ideas that give meaning to those practices. And there's an implied superiority, either by someone who has no religion or a religious believer who thinks that theirs is correct, but they still want to dabble, which allows for us to steal from the religion of others. So if we give up these hierarchies, it's one way to prevent religious appropriation. But actually what I'm suggesting here is a pretty radical rethinking of freedom in general, because privileging individual freedom ignores that self-optimization sometimes comes at the expense of others. I want to shift our focus a little bit. The rights of social groups should be part of our assessment of religious borrowing, including religious groups and groups that are marginalized within religious communities. So not only the religion, but am I particularly harming someone who's already marginalized within that community? So I pay a lot of attention. I do a lot of listening to female, Black, brown believers within the community as well. We need to take seriously when religious practitioners claim they are harmed by our engagement with our practices, and use this to understand forms of structural injustice that we unknowingly are benefiting from. Put simply, we have to realize that just because we can borrow our practice and want to, doesn't always mean that we should. Okay, but what if we want to go further? What if rather than merely understanding and tolerating religious difference, we let religious difference change us and become a source of values? Because it turns out that some of the devotional aspects of the practices that are deemed too dangerous for mainstream consumer, those elements that are left behind when practices are appropriated and go mainstream, can help mitigate some of the risks of the appropriation. And I'm going to talk about some of those more specifically when we get into case studies tomorrow. So the remedy for the harms of religious appropriation could be borrowing more, not less. At a very general level, religious worldviews can help challenge this very rampant idea that personal sovereignty is the most important by shifting our attention from individuals to communities. They can also de-emphasize the importance of human agency in general by providing ways for us to think about like beyond self-reliance and self-actualization as the sort of primary goal of human activity. In other words, more religious literacy, my suggestion one, could change our stance towards other religious communities that we're not part of, my suggestion two, and how we understand freedom, my suggestion three. So on a more civic level, religious values can be recruited to help prevent some of the forms of exploitation that religious appropriation creates. And again, we're going to get into that more tomorrow. So careful engagement with the religion of others has the potential to help us understand communities different from our own. But it can also fundamentally change the way we see the world and provide ways for dismantling structures of privilege, inequity, and alienation. That would involve much more, not less religion. Okay, some of you might be beginning to see yourself as an agent of religious appropriation, borrowing the religion of others in the pursuit of what you consider to be non-religious goals like health and well-being. I myself have appropriated religion. My Madonna phase, some of my pedagogical choices you're going to hear about with the Camino trip, my personal wellness practices like yoga, even my politics. These have all involved appropriating the religious practice of others in ways that I'm frankly embarrassed by now. In fact, much of studying my religion is reflecting on these icky things I've done. And as research for the book, I intentionally engaged or leaned into ways I was doing religious appropriation to get sort of an insider look at that phenomenon. Tomorrow I'm going to discuss two of those cases, right? So I'm going to discuss, I'll give you a little preview here, my exploration of pilgrimage tomorrow, which is the second lecture, draws on my experience walking the last 150 miles of the Camino in Spain 5 times with college students as part of an intensive study abroad program that I designed for Northeastern University, which literally requires religious appropriation for course credit. Did not realize that. That's what it does. My mom was a yoga, this is me, but my yoga teacher training, because I'm a certified yoga teacher, but my mom was a yoga teacher before that was cool. You'll hear about her tomorrow. And I practiced yoga myself for 25 years, probably. As part of the research for my chapter on yoga, I became a 200-hour certified Kripalu yoga instructor, and I then volunteered to teach a weekly class at my university campus. And I had to figure out how to do so in a way that didn't feel like it was some sort of exercise of colonialism. It's really hard. I don't teach anymore. Hear about that tomorrow too. So my experiences with religious appropriation show how challenging navigating the ethics of religious borrowing can be, even for an expert in ethics and religion. That's literally what my degree says from the University of Chicago. I have a PhD in religious ethics, and yet I keep messing this stuff up. This stuff is hard. But when I acknowledge these mistakes, take moral responsibility, and reflect on what I could have done better, I hope they become teachable moments for me and for others. Hope they can begin conversations. Right? I don't have the answers. I just want to start conversations. And that's what I've tried to do tonight. All right, thank you.